Good morning, students. Today's class, this practical class, will be about the eyeball. Now, as you know, that the eyeball is the most important content of the orbit. It is the most important content of the orbit and occupies the most space within the orbital cavity of the human beings. Now, actually, it is embedded. The eyeball is embedded within the orbital pad of fat and is covered by thin membranous sac, which is known as the fascia bulbi or the Tennant's capsule, which encircles the eyeball, and the eyeball moves within this Tennant's capsule of the fascia bulbi uninterruptedly. Now, what actually, if you see the eyeball, the anterior part of the eyeball or the anterior 1/6 represents the portion of a smaller sphere, which is actually the cornea. This is the anterior 1/6 which represents the portion of a smaller sphere, and the posterior fifth-sixth of the eyeball represents the section of a larger sphere. So, if you consider the eyeball, the anterior 1/6 is a part of a smaller sphere. This is the anterior 1/6. This will represent the part of a smaller sphere, and the posterior 5/6, which will represent the part of a larger sphere. Now, this is actually representing what is known as the cornea, and this is what is actually known as the sclera. We will go into the different tunics of the eyeball, or the coats of the eyeball later on. First of all, to give you an introduction about the eyeball. Now, if you look at the midpoint of the anterior curvature of this cornea, this is known as the anterior pole of the eyeball. And if you look at the midpoint of the posterior curvature of the sclera, this is the sclera and this is the posterior curvature of the sclera. If you look at the midpoint of the posterior curvature of the sclera, this is what is known as the posterior pole of the eyeball. So, this is the anterior pole and this is the posterior pole. Now, the optic nerve, this is the optic nerve. The optic nerve pierces the eyeball slightly to the nasal side. So, this is the right eye, slightly to the nasal side of the posterior pole of the eyeball. So, the optic nerve pierces the eyeball slightly to the nasal side of the posterior pole of the eyeball, and just lateral to the posterior pole of the eyeball, we get a small depression here, which is known as, this is actually in the retinal layer of the eyeball. This is what is known as the fovea centralis. Now, this fovea centralis is the area which is responsible for the maximum visual acuity of the eyeball, and it contains the most number of, it is said that it contains the most number of rods and cones. So, the visual acuity at the fovea centralis is greatest. Now, if you draw an imaginary line joining the anterior pole and the posterior pole of the eyeball, the anterior pole is formed by the midpoint of the curvature of the cornea, and the posterior pole is formed by the midpoint of the curvature of the sclera. So, this imaginary line joining the anterior pole and the posterior pole, this line I am talking about, this imaginary line is actually known as the optical axis. And what about the visual axis? Now, if you join the anterior pole of the eyeball along with this fovea centralis, not the posterior pole, but the fovea centralis, this imaginary line joining the anterior pole with the fovea centralis is actually what is known as the visual axis. So in the human eye, the optical axis and the visual axis are not the same. Optical axis is the imaginary line joining the anterior pole and the posterior pole. Anterior pole is the midpoint of the curvature of the cornea, and posterior pole is the midpoint of the curvature of the sclera. So this is the imaginary line which represents the optical axis joining the anterior and the posterior pole, and the imaginary line joining the anterior and pole and the fovea centralis, these will represent the visual axis. So this is all about the optical axis and the visual axis. Now, if you draw an imaginary line which is equidistant from the anterior and the posterior pole through the middle of the eyeball like this, this imaginary line or the imaginary plane equidistant from the anterior and the posterior pole, which will be known as the equator, So this is all about the optical axis, the visual axis and the equator. And any plane which is at right angle to this equator, which cuts the equator at right angles, will be known as the meridians of the eye. Now what about the dimensions of the eyeball? Now each of the anteroposterior, the transverse and the vertical diameter, anteroposterior, transverse and vertical diameter of the eyeball are about 24 millimeter. In myopia, what happens? This anteroposterior diameter will increase. Whereas in hypermetropia, this is another faulty condition of the eye. In hypermetropia, this anteroposterior diameter will decrease. But both the anteroposterior, the transverse and the vertical diameter, all these three diameters are about 24 millimeter. So this is about the introduction to the eyeball. Now let us see what are the tunics of the eyeball, or the coverings of the eyeball. Now the coverings of the eyeball consists of an outer coat which is mainly fibrous in nature, and it consists of a major posterior part which is the sclera, and a smaller anterior part which is known as the cornea. So the outer tunic of the eyeball, which is mainly fibrous in nature, mainly consists of the sclera posteriorly, and in a small anterior part the cornea. What is actually the sclera? The sclera is nothing but actually the continuation of the dural sheath of the optic nerve. So the sclera represents the dural sheath of the optic nerve, and the anterior part of the sclera is transparent, through which the light refracts into the eye, which is known as the cornea. I will go into sclera and cornea later on. Now let us now consider the intermediate tunic or the intermediate coat of the eyeball. The intermediate tunic or the intermediate coat of the eyeball consists of, from posterior to anterior, three things. This is most posteriorly, you can see this is what is known as the choroid. After that, we get the ciliary bodies, and from the ciliary processes of the ciliary body, there are suspensory ligament of the lens which will help to keep the lens in its position. This is the lens. So from posterior to anterior, the middle coat consists of the choroid, the ciliary body, and this is what is known as the iris, and the space through which the light will diffuse into or refract into or enter the eye is what is known as the pupillary aperture. Pupillary aperture, and this pupillary aperture will be controlled by certain intrinsic muscles of the eye present in the iris, which are known as the sphincter pupillae and the dilator pupillae. So the middle coat consists of the choroid, the ciliary body and the iris, and these three things together are often referred to as the uveal tract. These three things, that is the choroid, the ciliary body and the iris, together are occasionally referred as the uveal tract. Now what is actually this choroid? This choroid actually represents the pia and the arachnoid matter. Pia and the arachnoid matter of the brain. It is derived from the pia and the arachnoid matter of the brain, and this middle coat of the uveal tract is often referred to as a vascular coat. A vascular coat. So the outer coat consisting of the cornea and the sclera is referred to as the fibrous coat. The middle coat, the vascular coat of the uveal tract consisting of the choroid, the ciliary body and the iris, and the inner coat or the inner tunic of the eyeball, which is nervous in nature or often referred to as the nervous coat, which is known as the retina. Now the specimen we will see here later on will be not of the human eye, but it will be a bull's eye or a ox's eye. A bull's eye or a ox's eye. The main difference between the human eye and the bull's eye or the ox's eye is that the inner part of this retina of the bull's eye or the ox's eye, and often in some animals, mostly in some animals, consists of an extra coating which is not present in the humans, which is known as tapetum lucidum. And you have already seen that in the dark, if you glow or point a torch in the eyes of a cat or a dog or a cow or whatever you may say, many of the animals has got it, they glow. That glowing thing is because of the presence of the tapetum lucidum in the inner layer of the retina. But in the human eye, you will not get this tapetum lucidum. And another difference between the human eye and the ox's eye will be the size. The human eye will be smaller in size, whereas the ox's or a cow's eye will be larger in size. So this is all about the three coats of the eyeball. And what does the retina mainly represents? The retina is basically developmentally part of the diencephalon, a part of the diencephalon. So you may consider the retina as a part, developmentally as a part of the brain, and is developed from the diencephalon. So the outer coat of the sclera is derived actually from the dural sheath of the optic nerve. The choroid is basically representing the pia and the arachnoid matter, developed from the pia and the arachnoid matter, whereas the retina is developed or is a part or developmentally a part of the diencephalon. Now let us go to the outer tunic of the eyeball. Let us study the outer tunic of the eyeball. Today we will only study the outer tunic of the eyeball, that is the sclera and the choroid, sclera and the cornea. Sorry, not the choroid, but the sclera and the cornea. The sclera is basically a fibrous coat and is opaque in nature, and the white of the eye you can see through the conjunctiva is basically because of the sclera. This white of the eye is basically because of the sclera. Now the sclera represents the posterior 5/6 of the eyeball, and is a part or segment of the larger sphere that I have talked about previously. Now the sclera is covered, I have not drawn here, but the sclera is covered outside by a membranous sac which is known as fascia bulbi or the Tennant's capsule. But this Tennant's capsule of the fascia bulbi is not intricately attached to the sclera. there is a space between the sclera and this Tenon's capsule, which is known as the episcleral space. Episcleral space. And due to the presence of this space, the eye can move freely. The eye can move freely within the Tenon's capsule. Now, if this is the Tenon's capsule, this is the Tenon's capsule, and this is suppose the eyeball, this space between this sclera and this Tenon's capsule, this is what is known as the episcleral space. Due to presence of this episcleral space, the eye can move freely within this Tenon's capsule in every direction. Now let us see what are the structures piercing, but before going to the structures piercing the sclera, a short recapitulation about the structure of the sclera. The sclera is mainly opaque and is mainly consisting of thickly woven collagen fibers. So the sclera is basically consisting of thickly woven collagen fibers, and which makes it opaque and gives it a whitish appearance. Now let us see what are the structures that are piercing the sclera. This will be asked in the examination, very important, remember. So the main structure which is piercing the sclera is the optic nerve. And the area where the optic nerve pierces the sclera forms a depression which is known as the optic disc or the blind spot. Why this is known as the blind spot? Because you can see here, this violet thing represents the inner retinal layer of the eyeball. There is no retinal layer within this attachment of the optic nerve or at the area of this optic disc. That is why there are no rods and cones here. That is why there will be no visual perception if the light falls within this area of the eyeball. That is why due to the absence of the rods and cone cells in this area of the eyeball and the absence of the retinal layer, this part is also known as the blind spot. And the area where the optic disc pierces the sclera here resembles that of a sieve. That is why this area is also known as the lamina cribrosa due to its sieve-like appearance, or otherwise due to the absence of the rods and cone cells. This is also known as the blind spot because there will be no visual perception here. So the main structure piercing the sclera is the optic nerve. Along with the optic nerve, the other structures that pierce the sclera will be the central artery of the retina, and coming out will be the central vein of the retina. So central artery of the retina and central vein of the retina. Other structures piercing posteriorly will be the posterior ciliary vessels and nerves. I have only drawn the diagram of the posterior ciliary artery here, but there will be also the posterior ciliary vessels and nerves. So the optic nerve along with the central artery of the retina and central vein of the retina, number 1. Number 2, the posterior ciliary vessels and nerves, number 2. Now at the midpoint between the sclerocorneal junction, that is the junctional area between the cornea and the sclera, this is what is known as the sclerocorneal junction or the limbus. Remember, if you see the eye as a three-dimensional structure, you can see the sclerocorneal junction as a depression between the opaque sclera posteriorly and the transparent cornea anteriorly. So this will be known as the sclerocorneal junction or the limbus, which is a circular depression. And this circular depression is also known as the sulcus scleri. It represents as a sulcus or a depression. So at the midpoint between this sclerocorneal junction and the posterior pole of the sclera or the posterior pole of the eyeball, some types of veins will, you can see here, some types of veins will pierce the sclera. These are known as the vorticose veins or veni vorticosi. Vorticose veins or veni vorticosi. Actually, the number of these veni vorticosi will be 4 or 5 in number in each eye. And anteriorly, the structures piercing the sclera will be the anterior ciliary arteries, and close to the sclerocorneal junction, the aqueous veins, which will collect the aqueous humor from the anterior chamber through a canal here known as the canal of Schlemm, or otherwise the sinus venosus sclerae, and these are known as the aqueous veins, which will ultimately drain into the anterior ciliary veins. The structures piercing the sclera will be the optic number 1, the optic nerve along with the central artery and the central vein of the retina. Number 2, the posterior ciliary vessels and nerves. Number 3, the veni vorticosi at the midway between the sclerocorneal junction and the posterior pole of the eyeball. These are 4 to 5 in number in each eye. And anteriorly, and number 4, they will be the anterior ciliary arteries and the aqueous veins, which will ultimately drain into the anterior ciliary veins. So these are the structures which will pierce the sclera. Now there is nothing much more to tell about the sclera except a few of the functions of the sclera. What is the main function of the sclera, or what are the main functions of the sclera? Number 1, it helps to maintain the shape of the eyeball. Number 2, it gives attachment to the tendons of the extraocular muscles. The extraocular muscles has been taught to you or will be taught to you in a separate class. I am not going into that, but the sclera gives attachment to the extraocular muscles. Number 3, it also helps to maintain the intraocular pressure of the eyeball. So it supports the interior of the eyeball or the inner tunics of the eyeball, that is mainly the uveal tract and the retina. So it is supportive in function. The sclera is mainly supportive in function, and it helps to maintain the intraocular pressure, which is about 15 to 20 millimeter of mercury. In case of increased intraocular tension, the clinical condition that is produced is what is known as glaucoma. And the other function that I have already told you, I have told you that there is a space between the Tenon's capsule and the sclera. That is what is known as the episcleral space, and the eyeball moves within the socket of this Tenon's capsule in different direction because of the presence of this episcleral space. So these are in short about the functions of the sclera. Now let us go into the cornea. The cornea represents the anterior 1/6 and a part of the smaller sphere which comprises the eyeball. It represents the anterior 1/6 of the eyeball, and it actually represents a part of the smaller imaginary sphere which comprises the eyeball. It is transparent. The main characteristics of the cornea is it is transparent and avascular. It is devoid of any blood supply. And it is a continuation of the sclera anteriorly, and the thickness of the cornea at the center is a bit less. It is about 0.5 millimeter, and at the periphery it is slightly thicker. At the periphery the cornea measures about 1 millimeter. So it is thinner in the center and thicker in the periphery, and at the junctional area between this sclera and the cornea, we will get a circular ditch or circular sulcus, which is known as sulcus scleri, or otherwise the sclerocorneal junction. Now, just posterior to the sclerocorneal junction, we get a canal which is known as sinus venosus scleri. Sinus venosus scleri, just posterior to this or adjacent to this sclerocorneal junction. This is known as sinus venosus scleri, or otherwise canal of Schlemm. Canal of Schlemm. It is through which the aqueous humor will drain into these aqueous veins and ultimately into the anterior ciliary veins. Now, this aqueous humor is actually produced by the ciliary processes of the ciliary body. It first comes into the posterior chamber of this eyeball anterior to the lens, then comes to the anterior chamber through this pupil or the gap between the iris, and from the anterior chamber it ultimately drains through the sinus venosus scleri of the canal of Schlemm into the aqueous veins and ultimately into the anterior ciliary veins. So, this is all about the production of the aqueous humor and the drainage of the aqueous humor. But eye has also got a posterior compartment which is mainly comprising of the vitreous body. We will go to it later on, and it also presents a hyaloid canal which is actually the remnant of the hyaloid artery developmentally. Hyaloid artery is not present in the adult eyes, but it is a developmental structure. The hyaloid canal represents the hyaloid artery developmentally. Now, let us go to the cornea. I have already told you that it is transparent and it is avascular. So, how does it get its nutrition from? It is avascular. So, how will it get its nutrition? It actually get its nutrition. It is lined anteriorly by the conjunctiva, by the bulbar conjunctiva, and at this conjunctivo-corneal junction, there are presence of loops of capillaries. These loops of capillaries will give nutrition to the cornea. Number one source. Number two source is the aqueous humor, which is present in the anterior chamber, produced from the ciliary processes, comes to the posterior chamber and goes to the anterior chamber. So, it also gets its nutrition from the aqueous humor. And number three source or third source of nutrition is from the thin film of the fluid secreted by the lacrimal glands, which covers the anterior surface of the cornea. Now, the refractory apparatus of the eyeball consists of the cornea, the aqueous humor, the lens, and the vitreous body. Four things are there in the refractory media of the eye: the cornea, the aqueous humor, the lens, and the vitreous body. But the most prolific amount or the most major amount of refraction takes place in the anterior surface of the cornea. Remember, most of the refraction of the eye takes place in the anterior surface of the cornea. Now, let us see about the microscopic organization of the cornea. The cornea from outside to inwards mainly consists of 5 layers microscopically. The most outside layer is the corneal epithelium. The outermost layer is the corneal epithelium. Now, the corneal epithelium, what type of epithelium is present in the cornea? It is basically non-keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. And it is about 5 cells thick. And at the sclerocorneal junction, it is said to be about 10 cells thick. So, most outside layer of the cornea is the corneal epithelium. Underlying the corneal epithelium, there is the anterior limiting membrane or the Bowman's membrane. So just below the corneal epithelium will be the anterior limiting membrane or the Bowman's membrane. Now next to it, the third layer from outside inwards will be the substantia propria. Substantia propria. Now it is the most voluminous layer of the cornea and consists of uniform lamella of keratan sulfate and chondroitin sulfate. Due to the presence of this uniformness of this lamellated architecture of this substantia propria, the cornea is transparent in nature. So the third layer is the substantia propria. These layers are very important and it may be asked in the examination. So outermost layer is the epithelium. Second layer next to it will be the Bowman's membrane of the anterior limiting membrane. Third layer will be the substantia propria. Now I am going to the fourth layer. The fourth layer is known as the inner or the internal limiting membrane or the Descemet's membrane. Descemet's membrane. The Descemet's membrane presents some trabecular meshwork of collagen fibers, and at the area of the iris, this Descemet's membrane gives away certain zonular fibers which are known as the pectinate ligament of the iris, which helps to keep the iris in place. So the fourth layer is the Descemet's membrane, and the innermost layer will be comprising of the endothelium, which is mainly constituting of cuboidal cells, single layer thick. So these are about the 5 layers of the cornea, and I have also already told you about the sclerocorneal junction, where we will get the canal of Schlemm or the sinus venosa scleri, through which the aqueous humor will drain into the aqueous vein and ultimately will go into the anterior ciliary veins. So this is about the introduction to the eyeball and the outer tunic of the eyeball. The intermediate coat we will discuss in the next class. Now let us go to the specimen and see a few things, but there is nothing much to see. Now here you can see the eyeball, but obviously this is not the eyeball of the humans. If you are asked what eyeball is this, you will say that this is the eyeball of a bull, or a bull's eye, or an ox's eye. I have told you the difference, that it will be larger when compared to the eyeball of the humans, and it presents a special layer which is known as tapetum lucidum, which lines the inner side of the retina. I will show you later on. Now here you can see the optic nerve here, which pierces the sclera. These are the orbital pad of fat. You can see here the orbital pad of fat, and here you can see the transparent cornea, and the sclera here, and the sclera is here. The surrounding part is the sclera, and this is the conjunctiva. Episcleral space you can not see here. Tenon's capsule cannot be seen here. So this is the optic nerve, this is the cornea of the transparent, and this is the outer tunic, that is the sclera. The outer tunic consists of the sclera and the cornea, and this is what is known as the limbus or the sclerocorneal junction. There is a sulcus here which delineates the sclera from the cornea, that is known as the sulcus scleri. Now here, this is the cut section of the eyeball. Here you can clearly see this bluish thing which is glowing here. This is what is known as the tapetum lucidum. So this will help you. This is the tapetum lucidum, which lines the inner side of the retina. And here you can see the optic nerve, and this area where the optic nerve will pierce will be known as the blind spot, Fovea cannot be seen here. It is a small depression just lateral to the blind spot, but the tapetum lucidum can be seen here clearly, this shining thing, and this is the retinal layer. This is actually the retinal layer. Choroid cannot be seen here, but here also the cornea and the sclera can be seen. Iris cannot be seen here. This is another cut section. This has unfortunately collapsed. This eye has unfortunately collapsed. The optic nerve is here. This is the posterior pole. And the anterior pole will be somewhat here. So here also you can see the cornea, the sclera, and this is the innermost layer of the retina. Tapetum lucidum is not very clearly seen here. This is very clearly seen in the other specimen that I have shown you, and this is the conjunctiva. Ciliary body and the ciliary processes cannot be very well seen here. So this is all about this specimen. Most of the questions will be asked will be theoretical. Thank you.